There's something nobody talks about honestly enough. And if you've been wondering why things started so well, why there was chemistry, why there was real connection, and then, without warning, it just faded, I want you to know something important before we go any further. It wasn't random, it wasn't bad luck, and it almost certainly wasn't what you think it was. Most people misunderstand what actually pulls a woman's heart closer, or what quietly, almost invisibly, pushes it away. Society gives men a script. Be confident, be funny, be successful. And while none of those things are wrong, they miss something deeper, something psychological, something that operates beneath the surface of every conversation, every text, every moment of eye contact. What if I told you that the mistakes that make women lose interest have almost nothing to do with how you look, how much money you make, or whether you said the perfect thing? What if the real reasons are rooted in something far more emotional, far more subtle, and far more fixable than anyone has ever told you? Today, we're going to go there. We're going to look at 7 psychological mistakes that quietly erode attraction. Not to shame anyone, but because understanding is the beginning of real change. And if you've ever felt that connection slipping through your fingers and didn't know why, stay with me. Because what you're about to discover might finally make everything make sense. Let's begin. The first mistake is performing instead of being present. There's a version of attraction that most men are taught to chase. Impress her, make her laugh, say the right thing at the right moment. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. But psychology shows us something crucial. Human beings are wired to detect authenticity. Researchers call it the realness signal, and women, who are generally more attuned to emotional nuance, pick up on its absence almost immediately. When you're performing, when you're in your head rehearsing what to say next, managing your image, trying to appear a certain way, you are not actually there. And she feels it. She can't always name it, but she senses it. The conversation feels slightly hollow. The energy feels slightly off. And gradually, without knowing exactly why, her emotional investment starts to quietly withdraw. Think about the last time you spoke with someone who was truly, completely present with you. No phone glancing, no half attention, just there. It felt rare, didn't it? Almost magnetic. That's not a coincidence. That presence is one of the most attractive things a human being can offer another. And the moment you stop performing and start genuinely showing up, curious, attentive, real, the entire dynamic shifts. The second mistake is making her responsible for your emotional stability. This one is difficult to talk about, but it's one of the most important things you could hear. When a man's mood, his sense of worth, his emotional equilibrium, all of it depends on how she responds to him, it creates a weight she was never meant to carry. Psychology refers to this as emotional dependency, and research consistently shows that it is one of the most reliable predictors of attraction fading in early relationships. It shows up in subtle ways: the slightly wounded tone when she doesn't text back quickly, the shift in energy when she seems distracted, the way your confidence visibly rises or falls based on her warmth toward you. She notices all of it. And what it communicates, beneath all the words, is this: I need you to manage how I feel about myself. That's an enormous and exhausting ask. And the heartbreaking thing is that it often comes from a place of genuine care, genuine investment. But attraction, particularly for women, is deeply tied to the sense that a man has a stable core, that his sense of self doesn't rise and fall with every shift in the weather. When she senses that stability, she can relax into the connection. When she doesn't, she begins, slowly, almost unconsciously, to pull back. This isn't about being emotionally unavailable. Quite the opposite. It's about doing the deeper work of knowing who you are independent of her validation, so that you can actually be present with her, rather than quietly asking her to reassure you that you're enough. The third mistake is moving fast on the surface while avoiding real depth. There's a particular pattern that psychology researchers have observed in connections that start intensely and collapse quickly. Everything moves fast. Frequent texting, deep conversations about the future, plans made before there's any real foundation. But when you look more closely, something is missing. Actual vulnerability, real emotional honesty, the kind of depth that takes courage to show. Surface intensity can mimic connection, but women, particularly emotionally intelligent women, are very good at distinguishing between the two. Research on what women find emotionally compelling in partners consistently highlights one quality above almost all others: the willingness to be genuinely known. Not the willingness to be impressive, not the willingness to be mysterious, the willingness to be real. When a man moves fast, calls constantly, expresses strong feelings early, insists on exclusivity before trust has been built, but never actually shows who he is beneath that enthusiasm, it creates a strange dissonance. She may not be able to articulate it, but she feels it. Something isn't adding up. The intensity without the depth starts to feel like pressure rather than connection. And where there is pressure, interest does not flourish. It retreats. Real depth means occasionally saying something true that costs you something. It means admitting uncertainty. It means letting the conversation go somewhere uncomfortable and staying there with her rather than pivoting to safer ground. That courage, that willingness to be genuinely known, is extraordinarily attractive, and it is rarer than you might think. The fourth mistake is the slow disappearance of effort. In the beginning, you made effort. You planned things. You paid attention. You remembered what she said and brought it back later in ways that made her feel seen. And then, at some point, sometimes gradually, sometimes surprisingly quickly, that effort started to ease. Not because you cared less necessarily, but because comfort settled in, and comfort, left unchecked, can quietly look a lot like indifference to someone watching from the outside. Psychology shows us that perceived effort is one of the primary ways human beings assess how much they are valued in a relationship. This is not superficial. It is not about grand gestures or expensive dates. It is about the accumulation of small, deliberate signals that say, "You are still worth my attention. You are still someone I am choosing, not just someone I am used to." Women often describe this as feeling like they went from being pursued to being assumed. And the shift, even when it's gradual, even when it comes from a place of comfort rather than complacency, registers as a loss. Interest doesn't usually end dramatically. It ends in the quiet accumulation of moments where someone felt like an afterthought. The fix here is not complicated, but it requires consciousness. It requires asking yourself, with some regularity, what have I done lately that shows her she is still chosen, not taken for granted, chosen? That awareness, sustained over time, is one of the most quietly powerful things you can offer. The fifth mistake is handling conflict with avoidance or aggression. How you handle friction reveals more about your character than almost anything else. And women, at a deep psychological level, know this. When things get uncomfortable, when there's a misunderstanding, when feelings are hurt, when something difficult needs to be said, the response in that moment tells her everything about what life with you would actually look like. There are two common patterns that reliably erode interest. The first is avoidance, going quiet, deflecting, minimizing, changing the subject, waiting for things to simply pass. This communicates, however unintentionally, that emotional difficulty is not something you can handle. And if she cannot bring her full emotional reality to you without you disappearing or shutting down, she will stop bringing it. And then she will begin, gradually, to stop bringing herself. The second pattern is escalation, becoming defensive, raising the stakes, turning her concern into an attack she must now manage. This creates a different kind of danger, not the emotional absence of avoidance, but the emotional unpredictability of someone who cannot be disagreed with safely. What draws a woman toward a man, deeply and durably, is the sense that conflict can happen without catastrophe. that she can say something true and difficult and be heard, that he can hold space for her emotional experience without flinching away from it or defending against it. Research on what women describe as emotional safety in relationships points again and again to this capacity, the ability to remain calm, curious, and present even when things are hard. That skill can be learned, and learning it changes everything. The sixth mistake is making attraction feel like an expectation rather than something earned. This is perhaps the most subtle of all the patterns we're discussing today, and also one of the most quietly damaging. It's the unconscious shift from someone who invites connection to someone who expects it, from someone who is curious about her to someone who assumes her interest is simply a given, from someone who considers how she experiences him to someone who has stopped wondering. Psychology describes this as the transition from intrinsic motivation to entitlement, and research shows it is one of the most consistent drivers of declining attraction, particularly in the early to middle stages of connection. It doesn't usually come from arrogance. More often, it comes from insecurity wearing a mask. If I stop trying, I'll find out how she really feels. And some part of that fear gets answered by pulling back, and then interpreting her natural response as confirmation of the worst. But here's what's true. Attraction, for most women, is not a static thing that exists independently of what you bring to it. It is dynamic. It responds to presence, to effort, to growth, to the ongoing sense that this person is engaged with me, not just comfortable with having me around. The moment she begins to feel like an accessory to your life, rather than someone you are genuinely interested in and invested in, the moment she senses she is assumed, something in her begins to quietly recalibrate. The seventh mistake, and this one cuts deepest, is not knowing yourself. All of the patterns we've discussed today trace back, in one way or another, to this. A man who is performing rather than present is a man who doesn't yet feel safe enough in himself to be seen. A man whose emotional stability depends on her response is a man still searching for himself in other people's reflections. A man who avoids conflict is a man who hasn't yet learned to trust his own emotional steadiness under pressure. And what psychology shows us, across decades of relationship research, is that the single most attractive quality, the one that endures long after physical attraction, long after novelty, long after all the early-stage chemistry, is self-knowledge. The sense that this person knows who they are, what they value, what they stand for, what they want, what they're still working on, and that they're actually working on it. Women are not attracted to perfection. They are not drawn to men who have it all figured out. They are drawn to men who are genuinely, honestly, courageously in the process of figuring it out. Men who look inward without flinching. Men who take responsibility without spiraling. Men who can sit with her and say, honestly, here is who I am, and here is where I am still growing. That honesty, that self-awareness, creates a quality of presence that no performance can replicate. It is disarming. It is rare. And it is, in the truest sense of the word, deeply attractive. So let's come back to where we started. If you've ever watched a connection fade and not understood why, I hope something in this conversation today gave you a window into the why. Not to make you wrong. Not to make you feel like you've been failing. But because awareness is where everything changes. Because the man who understands these patterns is already different from the man who doesn't. Already moving, even slightly, toward something more real, more grounded, more genuinely connected. You don't need to be someone else. You need to be more of who you actually are, with more presence, more emotional steadiness, more willingness to be seen and to see. That is not a small thing. That is, quietly, everything. If this spoke to something in you, if it helped something click into place, I'd encourage you to subscribe to this channel. We go deep here. Every week we explore the psychology of who we are, how we connect, and what it really takes to build something meaningful. There are people finding themselves in these conversations every day, and there's room for you here too.